Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the TUC's webinar series. This is our first webinar after the summer break, and we're really pleased to be doing these again. Before we get on to the subject of today, just a reminder, in case any of you are new, I'm Anna from the TUC. I'll be joined very soon by Emery from the Labour Research Department. But first of all, just a little reminder, as I said, in case you are new, we do have live captions on this webinar. So if you want to follow along with those, please click the green button that's underneath the video and you'll be able to open a new window and watch the webinar with the captions. We are, of course, recording today. So if you miss any of it or you want to rewatch it or share it with your colleagues, we'll be sending a copy of this recording to all of you who've registered, along with any resources that we mention. So don't worry if you miss anything, you'll be able to catch up. As ever, it's great to see so many of you chatting in the panel on the right-hand side. Just before we went live, Lewis and I were saying it's great to see all the different workplaces, some really interesting ones today, so do keep them coming. Okay, something a little bit different. Many of you will have seen that we are having a face-to-face event for workplace reps on the 6th of October here in Congress House in London. And we'd really love to see and meet so many of you there. We've been doing these webinars now for a few years, and we love doing them. We love meeting you via a screen, but we really want to meet you face to face as well. And this event is going to have speakers from Thompson Solicitors, from the Hazards Campaign, from ACAS, and Lewis told me just now that he's also going to be running a workshop on pay, so you can come along and meet him. You can also come along and meet me, and I can't wait to meet some of you. So I'm just going to put up on the screen now a QR code, which will, if you follow this QR code, it will take you to a registration page for this event. I'll leave that there for a second or two so that you can click that with your phone. If you don't want to follow that now, don't worry, we'll be posting the links to it in the chat, and we'll also send some more information round about what's on at the events. Yes, absolutely, Phil, we will be using this first session in London as it's like as the first event, and we're hoping to then in the months coming up, months that follow, we will be looking to roll this out around the country in other areas. So I'll just get rid of that. Okay, yes, we'll share the link again. It's just come up in the chat, and we'll keep sharing that with you so you don't miss out. Okay, on to today's subject. We are really lucky to have Emery from the Labour Research Department with us. And we're going to be talking about sickness absence, because we know this is a really important issue in the workplace that probably affects every rep in some way, shape or form during their time as a rep. So what we're going to be moving on to now is how reps can ensure that their employer is managing sickness absence in a clear way and that is consistent with their equality responsibilities. So there will be an opportunity to post your questions to Lewis after we've heard from him, but please do post those in the Ask a Question section at the bottom. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Lewis to introduce himself and to get going. So Lewis, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Anna. Well, I think I'm lucky to be here, and I'm really happy to see all of you signing in. Perhaps we know we know each other through your contacts with the Labour Research Department or Payline, which is our pay and conditions database that I mainly work on. So to introduce myself briefly, I'm a wages and conditions researcher at the Labour Research Department, which is a long-standing organisation providing support for the trade unions. That's what we do. And unions affiliate and so on, and we have a relationship which we really value. And that includes getting information in from you guys about what's happening in the workplace and the sort of issues you're facing. And sick pay certainly is an issue that I've always felt very strongly about, and hoping that we can kind of cover some of the bases today. It's a complicated topic, so we're not going to be able to cover everything, and it may be you have questions I don't have answers for, but we will see. I'm happy to start the presentation when you are, Anna. We have 10 slides, of which this is the first, and I'll just say, by way of apology, some of these slides are a bit dense, to be honest. I mean, I like my slides light and airy, and these are not. But I'm hoping that there'll be something in there that you'll find worthwhile anyway as we go through. So it's a broad topic, sickness, absence, and sick pay. It's a potentially complicated one. I'd like to focus today on 3 levels, which I think you as union reps will be dealing with. And I'm putting those up as income protection, health protection, and employment protection. And I will explain why I've chosen those headings as we go through. I mean, I say it's tricky because it's both a collective issue and an individual issue at the same time, and I think that throws up its own problems. But we hope we'll find this useful today anyway. So if we could go to slide number 2, please, Anna. I flagged this up here. Basically, support for somebody who is deemed incapable of work that they should normally do starts with sick pay. Every member has a stake in that. What they receive depends both on statutory sick pay and anything better their employer might offer or that unions can negotiate. So what is SSP? It's a work-related entitlement, not a state benefit. So the employer pays it, unless they're insolvent. Its weaknesses, well, the first one hits you straight away in the face, £99.35 per week. Is the weekly rate. That's just 15% of median full-time earnings. The daily rate depends on how many qualifying days are worked in the week. You have to be ill for at least 4 days in a row, including non-working days. That's classed as a period of incapacity to work. And you must wait for 3 qualifying days, those are working days, before it actually becomes payable. These are known as the waiting days. In fact, the £99.35 is a bit of an illusion, to be honest. If you're only going to be sick for 4 or 5 calendar days, you can easily end up getting an awful lot less than that, possibly nothing at all. I was playing around just earlier this morning with the government's Calculate Statutory Sick Pay web page. It's an eye-opener if you're not familiar with SSP. I definitely would recommend playing around with it yourself as a rep. Moving on to, well, the obvious inequalities of SSP, and equality is a very important topic within the sick pay field. Apart from the poor level, there is the requirement to earn £123 per week, averaged over 8 weeks, to even become eligible for SSP. And that excludes 2 million workers, especially women, black and minority ethnic workers, and young workers. SSP is aimed at employees, which means that it excludes the self-employed and many of those classed as workers, unless they pay their tax through PAYE, for example, or they in a job that would entitle them to unfair or dismissal redundancy rights. So the shortfalls of SSP were revealed in the COVID pandemic because they made it payable from day one, and they had to, and for self-isolating. And there were £500 support payments for lower paid workers. And by and large, these have all gone now. And we're back with the basic scheme. Does it have any pluses? A couple. There isn't exactly a service requirement. You must have done some work for the employer to be eligible. But it is payable for up to 28 weeks. And in fact, that's longer than a lot of occupational sick pay schemes, as we'll get on to. If there are periods of incapacity of 8 weeks apart or less, they can be linked. And it can act as a top-up for occupational sick pay if you're in the kind of scheme where you get half pay, for example, in the NHS. It is, after all, the only sick pay available to 6.4 million workers. So let's not disregard SSP. Obviously, if you're in a unionised workplace, you almost certainly have an occupational sick pay scheme. It's likely to provide a higher level of support. Doesn't always do a lot better. Some people might say, it encourages absenteeism. And if we bring the third slide up, please, Anna. There's an interesting survey from 2011 for the DWP, which showed that employers with the same occupational sick pay rules have different levels of absenteeism. As it says here, it's not the scheme, but it's management that impacts on absence levels. And I think that's a really important message to take away. Occupational sick pay will be included in your written statement of employment particulars and in your key information document if you're an agency worker. And it does count as wages. So if the employer doesn't follow the rules, that could be a breach of contract. It might protect your income for as long as a year if you're in a really good scheme, possibly including a period and a half pay. But the duration is often less than that. At its best, occupational sick pay will have a limited service requirement and a rapid build-up of service-related entitlement, which is important from an equality point of view. It's another way in which sick pay and equality are tied together very closely. It should be as close to normal pay as possible, ideally with no waiting days, but again, we know that's not necessarily the case. If we can bring the fourth slide up now, please, Anna. So we know there's room for improvement in occupational sick pay because we saw it during the pandemic, the earlier stages of the pandemic. Based on information provided by union reps like yourselves for our Payline database, and as a plug, there is our email address there, pay@lrd.org.uk. Please do send us information about your collective agreements and sick pay. But based on that information, we know it can be extremely varied between different workplaces under all of the headings I've mentioned. And the scope for improvement is there. All of those bullet points on the left of the slide, replacing SSP with OSP, right the way through to harmonisation. These are all things we saw happening during the height of the pandemic, when employers just knew they had to pay. There can be a bit of discretion in an employer's sick pay scheme. If so, then there are certain rules that should definitely apply. There shouldn't be arbitrary behaviour by the employer. They shouldn't victimise or discriminate. And so on. They shouldn't treat part-time and fixed-term workers less favourably, and so on. The last point I want to make really under this sort of heading of occupational sick pay is just to say very briefly about holiday entitlement. You do accumulate it. Workers cannot be forced to take planned holidays if they are sick. But on the other hand, they are entitled to go on their annual leave if they are sick. There's a lot of EU and UK case law around this topic, and if you have an issue with your members and their holiday entitlement while they're sick, I really would recommend having a look at something like the LRD's Law at Work handbook or another authoritative guide, because it's a complicated topic. We know that a lot of workers have more than one job these days. You can be absent and claim SSP from one because you're unfit to do that job. For example, it might be a manual job, and you can still be working at the other job and being paid for that because it's not a job you're unfit for. Just a final word on this section before we pause. Some kinds of absence really should be provided for separately if possible. And the key example here is disability leave. If you can negotiate a separate disability leave policy, that would be a very good objective. I can just mention other forms of paid leave which will help take the pressure off of sick leave, time off for medical appointments, critical illness leave is another form of leave some employers have introduced, and obviously paid leave for caring for dependents or dealing with family emergencies. And again, during the pandemic, we saw employers relaxing and bringing in new forms of leave to allow their employees to attend to these issues. How much of that has survived? Not all of it for sure. So Anna, that's my first introduction about protecting incomes. The next is about protecting health, but I'll take a pause there.
Sure. Thanks, Lewis, for that great introduction to this area. I'm sure that people are formulating questions, as we're going along, and we will come to questions at the end after Lewis has finished his presentation. We are sharing a lot of links in the chat, including to a discount for the LRD's guide on sick pay that you could perhaps order through your branch. So please check that out. Don't worry if you missed the links though, because we'll make sure they're sent out to everyone. And one thing I forgot to mention at the beginning is if you are going to come along on October the 6th, tell us in the chat. We'd love to hear who's coming in advance. And yeah, you might be able to meet up with each other as well as us if you make a connection now. So our next section that we're going to hear from Lewis is about the procedures and policies that might be in place in your work with your employer to manage this area, and the kinds of things that reps should be aware of. So I'll move you on to the next slide, Lewis.
That's brilliant. Okay, thank you very much. Yes, health protection. So I think this is I've put this up as health protection because I really think it's important that we understand that sickness absence procedures should be thinking about employee health and well-being. It's not just all about screwing down on absence levels or whatever. So this is the direction I'd like to take in this section. The first thing I'd like to raise really is the concept of a duty of care, because employers do owe a duty of care to their employees. They must take reasonable care of employees' safety, avoid exposing them to unnecessary risks, and ensure a safe system of work. They also have a duty to maintain mutual trust and confidence. Now, we often hear stories about people swinging the lead or pulling a sickie. I'm sure you've all heard this far more times than you'd like. But there is another side to that coin, and I think it's important that it's understood and recognised. And this is the problem of presenteeism. And that is people working when they should be off sick. It's not just a union thing. I've seen it discussed in government documents. The personnel management people, CIPD, are really hot on that topic. And in fact, they've identified a closely associated problem, which they call leaveism, which is people using their own leave or time off because they're sick and because they're unwell. And why would they do that? Well, clearly, in some cases, fear of being picked on by management. It's not an invention. It's one of these things that's driving this. And I would recommend a recent report from the Alex Ferry Foundation. I don't have the name of it to hand at the moment, but it's about working time, and it includes a survey of workers in engineering and food manufacturing, and their experience with presenteeism is part of that. So a low sickness absence level is not always a sign of a healthy workplace. And I think it's important that employers understand that. This is why we need workplace policies focusing on employee health and well-being alongside a well-managed absence procedure. If we could have slide 6, please, Anna. Yep, what the stats say. Now, I don't want to deluge you with stats. In fact, I've got the slide here, frankly, to save me the bother of doing that. I just want to make the point that there are clear population trends and statistics around the main causes of sickness absence. And I think these can prove useful in any discussion about absence levels, whether it's across the business or even in individual cases. And there's some characteristics there which are clearly associated with trends in sickness absence. I would say beware if you're using this data with your employers. Different data sources produce different stats. We've used Office for National Statistics stats in the booklet, but there are other sources too that we've quoted. And also to say that there's always a lot more to be seen in the stats than the obvious headline figures. Work-related causes play a significant role in sickness absence, underlying the case for seeing absence policy in terms of health protection. In 2019-20, an estimated 38.3 million working days were lost in this way, with each affected person taking around 17.6 days off. These are stats from the Health and Safety Executive website, which you will be able to find for yourselves. Now, absence policies, going through the ingredients of an absence policy, they are often, they're all different, but they often contain the same sort of elements. And one of those is the distinction between short and long-term absence. Long-term health conditions contribute disproportionately to the overall total absence figure, whereas absence management policies often focus on recurrent short-term absence. Contrasting approaches to these two kinds of absence can be significant, not only for health outcomes, but also for employment and for the way employers handle sickness absence. If we can move on to slide 7, please, Anna. This is a summary of an absence policy in NHS Wales, which we've used in the booklet. Now, a quick apology to anybody who's here from NHS Wales. You may think this is not a good policy, or you may have all kinds of stories to tell me about NHS Wales. But for our purposes for the booklet, we introduced this policy because it has a sort of comprehensive feel to it. In general, employers should have an up-to-date formal policy or policies covering sickness absence. The policies themselves may or may not be contractual. This example it has a lot of the elements that we would expect to find in a sickness absence policy. Their words, do they manage to deliver on them? That's for you, a question for you to answer. But without those words and without that policy framework, I think you're in a weaker position. At least if they've said what they intend to do and how they intend to do it, you can hold them to account. The policies that they have should be consistent with all of their legal duties under equality law, as well as emphasising health and safety. They should be drawn up in consultation with yourselves and any health and safety committee. And they will recognise that an early intervention can make recovery and return to work more likely, especially in the case of stress-related illnesses and musculoskeletal disorders. Equality should be part and parcel of any absence policy, spelling out how the employer will, for example, approach disability or the management of pregnant employees. And the potential need for reasonable adjustments will be crucial in protecting employee health and employment. I'm going to come on to reasonable adjustments later on. So what are the ingredients in a sickness absence policy? Well, self-certification under the SSP scheme, where the employee can say, look, I've been sick for less than 7 days. I'm telling you I'm sick. That's obviously important. But in my experience of looking at lots of sick pay schemes, it's the notification stage which really seems to be critical. Workers are expected to report that they are off sick within a time limit set by the employer, and that holds true for SSP as well as for occupational sick pay. The employer may withhold SSP if notification is given outside the prescribed limit. Employers' notification rules for occupational sick pay are likely to be even more exacting. They could require medical certification, for example, earlier than at the fit note, but this should be in your contract. They will specify a time window for notifying them that you're off sick, the information to be provided perhaps, how they should be notified. They may even say by whom they should be notified, when further notification be required. And they may ask about the causes of absence or how long you think you're going to be away. I would just say this. I think the reasonableness of these rules, which I'm sure will have been made by the employer, is maybe something you want to review and just to see whether they're conveying the right message. Okay, so after 7 days of absence, we know you're going to need a fit note, also known as a statement of fitness for work or just a plain sick note to everybody else. This could be signed by a general practitioner, but since July this year, there has been a change, and fit notes, I nearly did it myself, fit notes can be signed by a nurse or an occupational therapist or a pharmacist or physiotherapist if they are treating the worker. It will say if the employee is unfit to work, but it can also say the employee may be fit to work if some adjustments are made. There are 4 options given. I'm not going to dwell on them now. I imagine you're familiar with them, but they don't give the employer the opportunity to escape their responsibility for making reasonable adjustments. The 2 things are separate, should be separate. In longer periods of sickness absence, absence policies will almost certainly have arrangements for the employer and the employee to keep in touch. These should be open to discussion and agreement and should not be too intrusive. One of the examples we've put in the booklet is from the Royal Mail, which says contact with your manager should be supportive rather than threatening. And I'm sure we can all recognise just how important that is. Returning to work is another key moment in any absence procedure and policy. Return to work interviews have become commonplace. They really should focus on protecting health rather than being punitive or intimidating. In cases of long-term absence, this discussion about return might best be started while the employee is still off. Managers should certainly ensure that any return to work interviews are private and not overheard, that they are distinct from any disciplinary procedures, and they should also cover if there's a need for any amended duties or retraining or occupational health support. Let's remember the idea here is to get your members back into work fit and happy, and that means supporting them and supporting their health. If a phased return to work is agreed, it's good practice for there to be full pay for the hours that are not actually worked. And managers should consider whether any follow-up advice or support is needed. These are all the good things that should come out of a return to work interview if one is held. And they're not always held. Monitoring data from absences like these informs policy and management, but it should also be used to address problems. Data can inform risk assessments. It can highlight if there have been near misses with workers' health. The purpose and methods of any monitoring of data should be clear. Yes, recording days of absence, occasions of absence, reasons for absence, but we must also remember the Data Protection Act 2018. Individual confidentiality must be respected, and employers should, in any case, be taking a case-by-case approach when they're dealing with absence in order to avoid discrimination. Nearly at our second break here. Just going through the stages in an absence procedure, the line manager. The line manager is likely to be the first point of contact when sickness begins, and a lot may depend on the quality of their response and their training. And that should include training in equality and disability issues. They will be expected to act reasonably, to take any protected characteristics into account, and to follow set procedures. So the manager's role is very important. And the final part in the jigsaw I want to mention here is occupational health. Now, I know different workplaces, especially workplaces of small or large size, may have different occupational health arrangements, but they will be called in potentially at one time or another to ensure that health workers are medically fit to carry out their work, that health is not being affected adversely by the work, and maybe to review the risk assessments that are being made when the worker comes back to work. I just end by saying this: the precise role of occupational health specialists may be one of those things it's worth discussing with management, because it can prove to be very important later on. That's the end of that section, Anna.
Thanks so much, Lewis, for that really key information. I think is really important for reps to consider. We all know that reps in the workplace are involved with both individual representation, which is what we're coming on to next, and collective policy negotiation. So while the points that are on the screen certainly don't cover everything, and there's been a little bit of discussion in the chat about things that it might not, it maybe is a good place to start and to see what you can build on. There's been a little bit of chat about how menopause-related absence might be dealt with, and sometimes there could be a separate policy about menopause. I think colleagues from the Wales TUC are discussing there about how they've worked with the NHS in Wales, I think, to bring in a separate menopause policy. So we do have information about that as well. Right, our third and final section from Lewis before we take your questions is we're going to hear more about the individual representation that workplace reps do, that we know is day in, day out the core of your role in many situations, and how you can support people who might be facing meetings with management around sickness absence.
Okay, Anna, you've cut yourself off there, but yes, thank you very much. Employment. Now, yeah, I've entitled this this last section "Employment Protection" because much as we want to defend the income of employees generally, and we want their health to be protected, we all know that we can arrive at a situation where employment is threatened by the employer on the basis of people's attendance and absence. We're really moving on here from the realm of collective agreements, which is what I mainly deal with in my work at LRD, to individual representation, and I'm sure it is the bread and butter of many of you. In doing so, we inevitably depend more on employment rights as interpreted by courts and tribunals than perhaps we do on collective agreements, although hopefully you'll have the collective backing of your members if things do get sticky around sickness absence. Many employers will have, as part of their absence policy, trigger points, and these can be the starting point for further action depending on an individual's attendance and sickness record. They can lead to an investigation or a discussion, which could be the prelude to a disciplinary or capability procedure. I think it's worth noting that a lack of investigation into absence can make later decisions and actions unfair. And I think that points, I'm sure, to keeping a record of what's gone on at various stages. Trigger points can be based on patterns of attendance, on duration of absence or its frequency. Some employers that we see, and we do receive a lot of information about sickness absence procedures here at LRD. This is how we are able to advise you on what's being done in different workplaces. A lot of employers do use multiple triggers. They might be looking at different characteristics, or they may be using the old Bradford factors system, which has been around for a long time. For those who know it, it multiplies up the number of absences with the overall duration using a well-established formula. In a nutshell, it counts frequent short-term absence more heavily than a limited number of longer-term absences. And there definitely are concerns about disability, discrimination associated with Bradford factors, but that's not to say that the system isn't still quite widely used as a trigger point. So with those trigger points, we then, potentially move into the realms of disciplinary action. But before I get on to that, I'd just like to have say a word or two about malingering, which seems like an ancient term, giving illness as a reason for absence when the employer doesn't actually believe that's the case. And I just wanted to flag up that this is different from a disagreement about whether someone is fit for work. Maybe the GP says they aren't and the employer thinks they are. That's a different scenario. Malingering is something different. But where occupational sick pay exceeds SSP, the employer may say that, they have to accept that sickness absence is genuine. Well, as long as that is written into the contract terms, then you have to deal with it. However, absence that is thought to be due to reasons other than health must still be assessed in good faith, not irrationally, with an implied duty of mutual trust and confidence. The employers have got to be consistent. They can't just fling out accusations. Case law examples suggest that where there is a footnote, it should be accepted at face value. And if there seems to be evidence to the contrary, for example, the results of surveillance, that should always be checked by a medical expert or professional. If an employer is beginning to think about dismissal arising from sickness absence, they will be looking for a fair reason for doing so. And if we can switch to slide number 9 now, please, Anna. They are likely to be doing so, quite likely at any rate, under the heading of capability. Capability is one of those 5 fair reasons for dismissal, although employers may possibly try to use some other substantial reason, SOSR, as alternatively. This is all about really the basis on which they might potentially be able to dismiss an employee fairly. They're unlikely to use conduct because incapacity is generally beyond the employee's control. So it's more likely to be capability or possibly SOSR. So while capability sounds like it might be something to do with how you perform in your job, it can also refer to health or any other physical or mental quality. So it can be applied in the case of someone who is too ill or too injured to do their job. Employers may use a capability procedure to manage sickness absence cases, although many do seem to rely on disciplinary procedures. The ACAS Code of Practice on Disciplinary and Grievance Procedures doesn't apply in the case of ill health dismissals unless there's an allegation of misconduct. So it may not be the help that you would hope it would be, although I dare say you could learn something from looking through it and perhaps take that, the general approach back to your capability procedure. Disability is one of those protected characteristics under the Equality Act 2010. Along with pregnancy and maternity, sex, age, race, sexual orientation, gender reassignment, and religion or belief. I understand the Equality Act doesn't apply in Northern Ireland, but there is similar legislation. There is also the public sector equality duty, which aims to eliminate discrimination. The reason I mention those 2 acts is because when we have a member facing capability proceedings, it's really important that we check to see that there is no discrimination involved, that it's not discriminatory attitudes that have basically, or policies that have got them into that position. So I'm going to focus on disability because it crops up in absence cases, some of which are summarised in our booklet. But obviously the risk of discrimination in relation to these other characteristics, particularly pregnancy, for example, shouldn't be overlooked. I'm sure they wouldn't be overlooked by yourselves in representing members. The Equality Act defines disability as a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on the ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. Colitis, which is a bowel disease, is given as an example in the notes that accompany the Act. I think that's helpful. There are certain conditions that are automatically deemed to amount to a disability: cancer, HIV, multiple sclerosis, being blind or partially sighted, and disfigurements. Disability caused by an illness is also not excluded, whether that be mental or psychological. And it can be the result of interaction between people with impairments and what are described as attitudinal or environmental barriers. Now, official figures do suggest on average that workers with disabilities experience higher sickness absence rates, and there can be a risk of discrimination which employers must avoid. Employers are required to make reasonable adjustments where a provision, criterion, or practice puts a disabled person at a substantial disadvantage compared with a non-disabled person. And a PCP, as the acronym goes, can include the sickness absence policy itself. Claims for reasonable adjustments or complaints about discrimination arising from disability may well fail if the employer doesn't know about the condition. So that's certainly something to bear in mind. It's a specialist area, perhaps it would be worth looking into in greater detail. We can't cover it all here today, but if we're looking into reasonable adjustments, then we do need to make sure that we've got an idea about what sort of changes the employer might make. By the way, issuing a disciplinary warning for disability-related absence would not always be a breach of the Act, but the employer would have to establish a legitimate aim, which justifies the warning. What could be a reasonable adjustment? By and large, it's going to be a measure that will help the employee return to work or remain at work. So if for example, it's not likely to be paying extra sick pay unless perhaps they're on a phased return. So the more valid examples would be, I'm sure these are familiar to you, adjusting workloads, adjusting trigger points, redeployment to an alternative job, although if it's a lower paid one, there's tribunal cases there, separately recording disability related absence, allowing more time off, amending start and finish times, amending duties, or providing new equipment. Bearing these points in mind, how do we think an employer should proceed if we've got to this stage? And a lot of this is to do really with looking to see what would tribunals make. This is where we need slide 10, please, Anna. Because in slide 10, I've been able to say an awful lot more than I can actually physically say in the time available. Basically, as our Law at Work, forthcoming Law at Work handbook explains, in the case of short-term frequent absences, medical evidence is not always needed for a fair dismissal, although employers must still consider alternatives and act reasonably. Workers can still be dismissed if they have a current medical certificate. So a tribunal would ask, how long would a reasonable employer in this situation wait before deciding to dismiss? And all the various characteristics there are things that they may wish to take into account, including a clear warning in writing about the risk of dismissal. I think if we can leave that slide up for a while, Anna, because it's the last slide I have. And in many ways, it's almost a checklist, really, of the things that should have happened. They should have happened when the employee first went off sick. They should have happened when the sickness absence policy and procedure was designed. They should have happened at every stage, really. And I think they just go to show, really, that employers have to be on their toes if they're going to pursue a member for sickness absence if they haven't been careful. So where all these actions have been exhausted and there is a risk of dismissal, and this is my final point, employers will have to go back over some of this and show that they have followed all the right procedures. And I have another checklist here. They should get expert medical advice. They should consult the employees themselves. They should investigate changes to the job. They should balance the impact between continued absence against the prejudice to the employee that will clearly arise. Warning in writing, following a fair absence procedure, and that includes following their own procedures properly. Considering any eligibility for a medical insurance plan that there may be, and allowing the employee to be accompanied to a capability meeting, making any adjustments to the whole process, really, so as to make sure the employee and their rep can fully participate, and of course allowing an appeal. So just to end, Anna, at this stage, a dismissal will be unfair unless the employer can satisfy an employment tribunal, if it goes to a tribunal, that this was wholly or mainly for one of the 5 statutory fair reasons, and that they acted reasonably by dismissing the employee for that reason. The tribunal would consider all of the surrounding circumstances and would decide on fairness in accordance with equity and the substantial merits of the case. That's the end of that presentation, Anna.
Lewis, thank you so much for that really comprehensive and important guide to what a tribunal might look for and the kinds of things that reps should be aware of if and when they're supporting a member with a case in the workplace around sickness absence. So I'm just going to leave that slide up for a minute, just while you're catching your breath before we have a look at some of the questions. But I've just been having a look at some of the information in the chat panel while you've been speaking. There's been quite a bit of conversation around a couple of things really. Well, COVID, which has been the biggest health issue that's affected all of us in many years, questions about long COVID. We do actually have a webinar in a few weeks about supporting workers with long COVID, so do register for that. We'll make sure that the link is sent out to you all. And there's also been some chat about the menopause as a workplace issue. We do have a workshop on October the 6th about the menopause and how reps can support their members on this. So please, if you can, come along, register for the event and attend that workshop. We absolutely will share Lewis's slides with you all, because I'm aware there's a huge amount of information that you will want to read again to help you digest it. But I am going to stop sharing that now. Just one more thing before we take the questions is that as with all training that we at the TUC put out for reps, you're able to get facility time as part of your facility time agreement for training as union reps in the workplace. So if you are wondering whether you can take time to come, remember that it is facility time. If you need help with facility time, always refer back to your union about that. Okay, we've had quite a few questions, and I'm going to try and group them so that we can cover as many subjects as we can. We've had quite a few people comment on the maybe conflict sometimes between what a GP or another doctor might recommend and what an occupational health therapist might recommend. In cases where there might be a conflict here, have you got any guidance, Lewis, on what a rep could do with these two competing opinions?
Oh, that's a tricky one, because you are dealing obviously with two different forms of medical opinion. We know, in fact, that employers can themselves say, "Oh, well, I just don't believe what the GP is saying." Clearly, it's more complex when the occupational health specialist is getting involved. But it's an interesting topic, and one, in fact, we were talking about this just yesterday, that in fact we would like to cover in our magazine Workplace Reports. So, which is what I mainly write for. So, if you do have experiences with occupational health services, please do send them in to us. Let us know, because we will be covering this in the magazine. I hope in the next couple of months. I think my experience with occupational health, standing outside the workplace, is that it's a very variable service. Different organisations, we know the classic example, the big corporation has its in-house doctors and nurses. Maybe that's an old model. I think maybe the accessibility of the occupational health staff themselves could be a problem. I mean, after all, how much interaction is there? How much opportunity for interaction is there between you as union reps and those occupational health professionals? And I think maybe that's where the solution lies if there is a conflict of this kind. In fact, before you get to the conflict, let's get some channels open between yourselves and the occupational health service your employer is choosing. And by the way, did they offer you any choice in occupational health service? Have they taken account of any member feedback on that occupational health service? Who else does that occupational health service work for? Have you got colleagues down the road, maybe in another branch of your organization, who have a different provider? I think once you start looking at this problem in detail, investigate it, I think you'll find that there will be ways to open up this so it's doesn't become a closed book, or where it's just they say this and they say that. Get yourselves into the problem and open up some room for the union in this relationship. That would be my kind of maybe slightly wishy-washy answer.
Not wishy-washy at all, Lewis. I think that's some fantastic advice of ways that union reps can maybe start to influence this. They might not have the final decision because that's going to be the employers, but they can absolutely start to influence it and maybe prompt a change. Okay, another question. You mentioned the Bradford factors or the Bradford scoring system. And there was some chat to say that, and you recognise this yourself, Lewis, that it's a system that does have issues. It's far from being ideal. But have you got any guidance on a reasonable level or scale of what would be fair to trigger disciplinary measures? So, for example, the person asking the question has said that their number has recently been reduced from 125 to 75. Are you hearing other situations like this?
It's a question which I've certainly, because we've been covering sickness absence here at LRD for many years. The current booklet we have on sickness absence is, I think, the third or fourth that we've done over the years. And Bradford Factors has been with us all that time. And I have tried, keeping a little record of the scores. They're very mixed. And obviously, if you go for a lower score, I think again, it's a bit like my previous answer in a way. I think if you kind of gameplay sickness absence stats, as I did this morning with the calculation of statutory sick pay, plug some different numbers in and see what's happening. What's the employer catching with that lower figure that they didn't feel they were catching previously? I mean, have they explained why they've reduced it? So I think it's because it is a kind of it's a magic box. It spits out a number depending on, basically, you multiply the number of occurrences of absence by itself. Mathematically, you square it, and then you multiply it by the duration of the absence. So basically, if you had and there are some numbers in the booklet actually, if you have go from one extreme to the other, somebody who has 3 months off sick in one go will get a much lower score than somebody who has every Friday or every Monday off, over a period of time. Obviously it's designed to try to kind of capture certain patterns of absence, but I suppose my worry about the Bradford Factors is it doesn't. It steers you away from the detail. And if you remember that we had that final comment from the it's actually from the Employment Rights Act, in accordance with the equity and the substantial merits of the case. If you're just going on a number, where are the substantial merits of the case? Where have they gone to? So although I can't answer your question directly with a number or a comment on the number, I think I would say go back and have another look at why it happened, how it happened, and what if actually the effects would be for member A or member B or member C with a different pattern of absence. And maybe I'm quite sure the employers have thought about it carefully and worked out why they want to reduce it to 75. But have they shared that with you? And open to challenge. Everything's got to be open to challenge, hasn't it?
Yeah, that's fantastic advice, Lewis. I think especially the suggestion of taking, employee A, employee B, and seeing how it would affect them to actually get some evidence of what this change would mean for real people, for real employees, rather than it just being abstract. Okay, we've had a bunch of questions as well about the relationship between annual leave, accrual of annual leave when you might be on sick, and whether annual leave can be used as part of a phased return. I've kind of bunched a few subjects there together, but if you could speak a little bit about annual leave in relation to sick pay, that might be really helpful.
Yes, I remember. I can again. I'm going to go around about the houses on this one, Anna. In putting together the current booklet, it was necessary to have a look and see what the various rulings have been over the years. And this is going to be covered in much more detail in the forthcoming issue of our Law at Work handbook. Basically, we've had a sequence of rulings both at European Union level mainly, but also at UK level, determining, can you carry forward leave? How far can you carry it forward? What are the circumstances, and so on. I think the important thing to remember with annual leave is that it's intended under the working time regulations to be a health and safety measure. It's designed to allow you to relax and get some respite from the pressures of work. And therefore, if you're going to start throwing annual leave into the mix for a phased return, then I think in a way, really, it's kind of almost self-defeating. The leave is there as a baseline for every employee in that workplace, be it 5.5, 6 weeks, whatever it 4.5, whatever the level is. It's been set at that level for all employees. And if you then start perhaps to incorporate it into a phased return policy, then in a sense, really, it feels a little bit like robbing Peter to pay Paul. Now I don't know if that sounds a bit too simplistic, but it's not a question I've sort of I'm aware of the complexity of it, and I would say actually for anyone who's put that question forward, we do, as well as looking forward to seeing you on the 6th of October, we do like to hear from union reps here at LRD as well. It's why we exist, to be honest. And so if you do have inquiries, even if you are not affiliated to the Labour Research Department, please do give us a try. And I'm sure Anna can give our contact details at the end. And particularly on that issue, for example, there are colleagues in LRD more qualified than I am to answer that, who may already be listening in and may already have the answer. But as you've asked me, that would be my answer. Robbing Peter to pay Paul sounds like the verdict on that one.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lewis. And absolutely, I echo what Lewis said just then, that we need to hear from you in workplaces so that we can improve the information that we're putting out. So please get in touch with Lewis or with us, and we'll share information so that we can basically get more and better resources out to you on these workplace issues. Okay, we are really, well, the hour's really sped by, but I'm just going to try and get a couple more questions in. We mentioned right at the beginning about SSP and OSP. Can they be claimed both at the same time, or are they completely separate entities?
Right. Yes. Thank you for that. I think the assumption is that OSP, the SSP, is absorbed, if you like, into OSP. That's the usual expression is, occupational sick pay includes SSP, but actually the relationship really isn't spelled out in quite those terms. And there are circumstances where a worker in a workplace with occupational sick pay will be relying on SSP. They'll be relying on it if their occupational sick pay doesn't cut in for 3 or even 6 months probationary period. And believe me, we do see examples of that coming through. It'll be, and if you've got anyone there in the NHS, I was looking at NHS sick pay just the other day, your half pay entitlement, so as in common with a number of public sector schemes, depending on your service, you have a number of months of full paid sick leave and a number of months of half paid sick leave. Now, in that half pay period, my understanding is that occupational sick pay can still come in and contribute to the total value of sick pay you receive. I mean, if I've got that wrong, please let me know. But I did look at this the other day. So there's a good example, isn't there, where where SSP is still there behind the scenes, driving a level of sickness absence, sick pay. And the other area, I think, is duration, 28 weeks. I mean, there are a lot of sick pay schemes that do not deliver 28 weeks total sick pay, even for somebody with 5 years service. So again, in that situation, your longer serving, your longer absent colleagues and members are going to be relying on SSP. So I think you've got to think about it as both schemes nesting together, so to speak, and both playing a role. Which is why at the beginning of this talk, I spent a bit of time on SSP. Because if you're in a workplace where we got a great sick pay scheme here, SSP is irrelevant to me. It's just for those 6.4 million workers who don't get anything better. But actually, it's it's there and definitely worth being familiar with, even if you have got a good occupational scheme.
Thanks, Lewis. Really helpful. I think I've got 2 last questions, but I think are pretty quick. What is the general guidance on contact with staff while on sick leave from their manager or the employer?
Yeah, thank you. This is quite a well-trodden area, to be honest. It definitely, first of all, it should be subject to discussion and agreement. It shouldn't just be imposed. I mean, there's a balance to be struck. Let's put it like that. And in fact, we did some research for the TUC many years ago. It was funded by the Department for Work and Pensions, actually, looking at rehabilitation of workers coming back from long-term sick leave. And we actually surveyed TUC safety reps. I'm talking a long time ago now. And what we found actually was that workplaces where the employer was more proactive and more involved with long-term sickness absence were generally those workplaces, if I remember correctly, where the whole procedure got a bit more of a thumbs up from union reps, from those safety reps. Because if the employer is just disinterested, they don't care, they don't bother, what message does that send to the employees? It says, I don't really care about your welfare and your health. So that is one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum, I think we all know the other end of the spectrum. Somebody being pestered, harassed, wrung, maybe even visited, maybe even, subject to surveillance. These things happen. And again, I suppose the antidote to this is to get it out in the open with the employer and talk about it. Let's make them talk about it. Make the health and safety officer or the personnel manager come to the health and safety committee and explain their approach and their thinking about keeping in touch with staff. I'm pretty sure once you start talking about it, that the strengths or weaknesses of their approach will come out.
Thank you, Lewis. And one final question, which I'm thinking probably will be quick. Do the LRD or the TUC, and this is something I'll check, do we have any information about how sick pay was won, like historically? I know pay is your specialism, so is it something you know about?
Yeah. Oh, that is an interesting question. I don't, but and it certainly, it predates me at LRD, which is not so easy to do. I think certainly there's been an evolution in sickness, in sick pay. The arrival of self-certification, for example, was an important moment because the whole purpose of that really was to get around a situation where doctors would be asked, for sick notes for short periods of time. But it's a good question. I don't know the answer to it. I will no doubt go away and look at it. If I could just say one more thing, Anna, before we wind up, which is on this very important question of the menopause. It's absolutely on our radar that employers, and if you were to look through LRD publications, in fact, if you have access, if you use the LRD publications online service, which is quite easy to find on the LRD website, if you type in menopause, I'm absolutely sure you will come up with reference after reference after reference where we've written about it in Labour Research or Workplace Report magazine or any of our booklets. And it certainly, I think it probably was in our previous sickness absence booklet. And I would also flag up other, there are other really important health problems, migraine, for example. In fact, there are, with menopause, with migraine, employers really need to open up and talk about these specific. It's not as if there's any mystery about it. It's a known, it's a part of life. Let's talk about it. And I think talking about health, well-being, and breaking it down, that's the way to go with sickness absence policy.
Thanks, Lewis. And I think that last point that you made about talking about things in the workplace is absolutely, that's what a rep, how they can introduce this, start getting these subjects on the table, on an agenda, get them out in the open just to start a conversation. Okay, we've gone over an hour. Thank you so much for everyone who stayed with us. I know there are some people who couldn't stay to the end, but you've always got access to the recording. It looks like this has been an incredibly popular subject. I thought it would be. So I'm thinking it might be something we come back to in the spring because there's loads of questions, and I think there's loads of things here that we can talk about. Just remains for me to thank everybody who's tuned in. You've been a fantastic audience of just short of 900 people, which I think is fantastic. Thank you to Lewis for being so insightful and so informative about this subject. See you again soon for more webinars, and hope to see and meet many of you on October the 6th for our face-to-face Union Reps Connect. And if you can't join us then, maybe next year when we do another session face-to-face. But bye for now, and we'll see you all again soon.